the Legal Corner podcast series. Welcome to today's episode of The Legal Corner, a podcast which covers a variety of legal issues to keep you informed. Hosted by attorney at law Colin Dinoon and communications specialist Leonardo Torres.
Thank you so much for joining us on another episode of the Legal Corner podcast series. I am your host, Colin Dinoon, attorney at law, and I'm joined by my co-host, Mr. Leonardo Torres, our resident communication specialist. Good day to you, Leonardo. How are you?
Good day, Mr. Dinoon. I'm very, very good, happy, and really looking forward to today's episode.
It's always a pleasure linking up with you. I mean, I'm starting to get accustomed to it now. You know, this is our third episode. And our theme that we are going to be looking at is the whole question of Tobago autonomy and whether it is an elusive dream. We have a distinguished guest joining us this afternoon. And before I bring her in, I would just like to provide a bit of perspective on the island of Tobago. As we all know, Trinidad and Tobago exists as a unitary state. However, there are divergences as it relates to the histories of the respective islands. We are focusing on Tobago. So Tobago would have been colonized by the Spanish, the Dutch, and the French. In the year 1889, Trinidad and Tobago were combined as a single British colony from an administrative standpoint, where both islands had one governor, the judiciary, and a code of laws. Throughout history, there have been various attempts at defining the administrative and functional relationships between both islands. In the year 1897, the Royal Commission recommended a complete amalgamation of Trinidad and Tobago as it relates to from an expenditure and administrative standpoint. Now, post-independence, there were stalwarts such as the late Adanna Robinson, who contributed significantly to efforts to achieve internal self-government for Tobago. The first iteration of the THA Act was passed in the year 1980, and it was later repealed and replaced by the current Act in 1996. After this, there have been various discussions and proposals without any real change to the status quo. This year, 2021, a bill was laid before Parliament entitled the Tobago Island Government Bill, and it is presently before the Joint Select Committee. Now, joining us today to provide her perspective on Tobago autonomy is Mrs. Adanna Joseph-Wallace. Mrs. Joseph-Wallace is a Tobagonian daughter. She attended the Scarborough Roman Catholic Primary School and then the Bishop's High School, where she was awarded the Sylvan Bowles Scholarship. Mrs. Joseph-Wallace holds a Bachelor of Science degree in government with a minor in social policy, a Bachelor of Laws, and a Master's of Public Law from the University of the West Indies. Mrs. Joseph-Wallace obtained her legal education certificate from the Hugh Wooding Law School, Trinidad, and also possesses certification as a trainer, vocational assessor, and in crisis management and communications. Mrs. Joseph-Wallace currently practices law in both Trinidad and Tobago, where she has appeared before the Magistrates Court, High Court, and the Court of Appeal. She also lectures in constitutional law, administrative law, and industrial relations at the Faculty of Social Sciences of the University of the West Indies. Mrs. Joseph-Wallace holds membership in the Trinidad and Tobago Law Association and has presented at the LATT's panel on the 30th anniversary of the Trinidad and Tobago Domestic Violence Act. Joseph-Wallace believes that her greatest accomplishment to date is that of wife and mother to her 4 children. Good day to you, Mrs. Joseph-Wallace, and welcome to the Legal Corner.
Good afternoon, Mr. Dinoon and Mr. Torres. Thank you very much for having me.
Right. So we are going to get straight into it because we know that Tobago is in an election season and the whole question of Tobago is dominating the national spotlight. So can you provide us with your perspective on what Tobago autonomy means to you?
Thank you. And I think that's a really good question. And it's a question that is often met with a lot of skepticism and a bit of cynicism at times because many equate that word autonomy with secession. However, the simplest answer to what autonomy means is the ability to manage one's own affairs. But even that definition itself is very inadequate. It's a very inadequate one because it doesn't really tell us what affairs and to what extent the management of those affairs would be. And these are, of course, important considerations because the answers to those kinds of questions may help to determine what is the best or most appropriate model to treat with this issue of autonomy in Tobago and for Tobago or any other place for that matter. So what affairs? Do we mean executive affairs or administrative affairs? Or does it mean legislative affairs? Or does it mean a mixture of both? Surely it doesn't mean judicial affairs because that's the remit of the judiciary. So what is the extent of the management of these affairs? Are we referring to exclusive jurisdiction by central executive or are we referring to legislative oversight? Or does it mean that we're referring to some extent with regard to legislative or executive considerations? Or are we referring to the management only with executive oversight from a central authority? Or does it mean shared sovereignty? So all of those considerations are loaded and jam-packed into this consideration of autonomy. And of course, because all these things are part and parcel of it, that is why there's so much emotion behind the idea of autonomy and so much and to a certain extent, why often it's a very misunderstood concept in the context of Trinidad and Tobago and Trinidad. So perhaps if we as a people are able to arrive at a clearer appreciation or understanding of all these considerations with regard to autonomy, we may find that we are able to appreciate this topic and this consideration and this quest by Tobagonians for autonomy within the context of this Trinidad and Tobago space with a bit more realism and understanding.
Thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much. It has really kind of given a good perspective on what that autonomy means, and how far-reaching the concepts and the certain items within autonomy and what it really reflects for the governance of the island. But I have a question as it pertains to what the current arrangement is, right? So, as it pertains to the current relationship between Trinidad and Tobago, how would you determine or how would you define that current arrangement from a governance perspective?
No, this might sound a bit controversial because there are a lot of murmurings in the public sphere, but I find that very often people use terms and words without a clear understanding. So I'm fortunately or unfortunately for you, although I'm sitting here as an attorney at law, I am also a person who started off in social sciences. So these terms mean a particular kind of thing, right? So I'm going to try my best to articulate giving consideration to both dynamics. So the current relationship is one of a unitary state. And I say that because when you look at the characteristics of, for example, a federation as compared to a unitary state, it is on the face very clear that this is a unitary state. That's the dynamic. And because of that, it means that the responsibility, that is administrative responsibility, is decentralized from the center or the core, or what is commonly referred to as central government, to the Tobago House of Assembly. And notice that I specifically said administrative power, because this means that some of the functions of the executive branch, and we're speaking specifically about the cabinet here, are given to the Tobago House of Assembly to perform some of these administrative functions. In fact, Chapter 11A of the TNT Constitution, Section 141B, says, subject to this Constitution, the Assembly shall have such powers and functions as in relation to Tobago as may be prescribed. But when you look at Section 141B, Section 141, or the entire chapter that deals with the Tobago House of Assembly, you cannot not look at Section 75(1) of the TNT Constitution, which says that there shall be a cabinet for Trinidad and Tobago, which shall have the general direction and the control of the government of Trinidad and Tobago, and shall be collectively responsible, therefore, to Parliament. Now, I started off answering this question by saying that even this phrase, unitary state, is a loaded one, and people have emotions about it. And there is banter back and forth in the public domain that nowhere in the TNT Constitution is there any reference to a unitary state. Actually, it's a sovereign democratic state. But as you would know, Mr. Dinoon, there are things that are expressly stated in the Constitution, and there are things that are implicit, meaning that they are implied. For example, nowhere in the TNT Constitution would you find the phrase, the separation of powers. But we know from Hines that this has been inferred based on the Westminster historical tradition, with Lord Diplock saying, these constitutions are evolutionary rather than revolutionary. So in the context of that, and in the context of constitutional interpretation, one can infer that based on the structure of the Constitution, we are operating in not just the structure of the Constitution, but where power resides, then we are dealing with a unitary state system.
So I know you got into the THA there, because that was that is one of the things that for most Trinidadians, Tobagonians, so they would always be aware of that THA as the body. Well, I guess to the average Joe, that will always be the representation for Tobago, right? But of course, we have already understand that it is a unitary state, but there seems to be, as we are getting into the conversation here, some room there for that could cause some conflict or some misunderstanding or not clarity, so that people can understand what really the arrangement is. But let me ask the question, as we would have mentioned, the THA. What would you say the exact role of the Chief Secretary within the THA Act? What would you say his real role is? Or her real role is?
Yeah, I would have told you about that, his or her, because the two persons who are vying for that position, one is male and one is female.
Correct. That's what I had to correct myself.
Yes. So as I said about Chapter 11A, the Constitution itself speaks of as prescribed, and of course, there is a THA Act which prescribes what the Constitution would have referred to. But what explicitly the Act says with regard to the Chief Secretary is that you may say to yourself, but we don't really. When I list out for you what the Act says about the Chief Secretary, you'll realize that some things have to be inferred. So remember, I said before that for lawyers, that there are things expressly stated, but there are things inferred as well. So the responsibilities or role of the Chief Secretary that are expressly stated would be that the Chief Secretary attends cabinet meetings if invited to do so by the Prime Minister. The Chief Secretary holds regular discussions with a view to formulating administrative and legislative mechanisms for the promotion of harmony in the affairs of Trinidad and Tobago. And then it says again, the Chief Secretary submits the Tobago House of Assembly's budget to the Cabinet by the third quarter, or on or before 30th of April each year. And it also says that the Chief Secretary shall present to the Prime Minister a report reviewing the activities of the Assembly during the year ended 31st December, immediately preceding. And final thing it expressly states is that the Chief Secretary assigns secretaries to carry out the functions of the Assembly. But we may infer certain things. So we may infer that the Chief Secretary is the head of the Executive Council, which is itself responsible, according to Section 34(1) of the Tobago House of Assembly Act. The Executive Council is responsible for carrying out the functions of the Assembly. And of course, the Act itself would say what those functions are. So Section 25 speaks of, and this is very important, without prejudice to Section 75(1). So even if the Tobago House of Assembly, through the Executive Council, is or has certain responsibilities, those responsibilities are subject to the responsibilities of Cabinet. So that is why I said the relationship is not one of power sharing, but one of an assignation of responsibility or decentralization of administrative responsibilities. So I don't know if I'm very clear with that. So as I said, Section 25(1) deals with those responsibilities under the 5th schedule of the Act. Section 27 speaks of those responsibilities that the Assembly may pursue or act as agents of the government or statutory authority. So it means that any authority or public entity that has an office in Tobago, the Tobago House of Assembly may be responsible for those services in Tobago, not because they're listed in Schedule 5, but because they're listed in the 7th schedule and maybe by way of a memorandum of understanding between the parties or some sort of arrangement like that. So even that in itself tells you that the power, the sovereignty does not lie with the Tobago House of Assembly. It is elsewhere, and responsibilities are assigned to the Assembly. So Cabinet continues to have the direction and control of the administration of the state.
Understood.
Now, as I would have mentioned in my introduction, before the Parliament, there's currently a Tobago Island Government Bill. Right? This bill seeks to produce certain changes in the relationship between Trinidad and Tobago. It seeks to devolve even further powers to the Tobago House of Assembly. What are your thoughts on the Tobago Island Government Bill?
Well, you see, I like the word that you used. You said devolve further powers. You did not say assign authority or power to. So that in itself would tell you the problem that is going to be met. Because if you're talking about autonomy, and yes, decentralization or devolution may be a form of autonomy, but if you're seriously speaking about autonomy, given consideration to, as you said, you would have spoken about A.N.R. Robinson, but before him there was James Bigart in the Trinidad and Tobago Legislative Council in 1925 to 1932, and then after him there was A.P.T. James. So you see, there has always been a successive line of the articulation of not just responsibility, but authority to accompany the responsibility. And I think that may be why there was so much backlash to a certain extent with regard to this latest permutation of a bill or bills, because there was also the constitutional amendment bill, because it continued to allow for the residing of power still with the central government. So as you rightly said, it was further devolution, but not a power sharing system.
What are some of the key proposed changes that you would be able to highlight for us today in the new bill?
Well, well, rather than list what the bill proposed, I will speak on two things the bill didn't propose. And those were two sticking points if you listened to the conversations and the dialogue emanating from different public spaces on the topic of these draft bills and what was provided for from the Joint Select Committee. So the two major sticking points or omissions might be a better word, have to do with finance and territorial demarcation. And they are intertwined because the non definition of Tobago's maritime boundaries or the continuation of the 8 nautical miles responsibility of TNT's territorial waters and not Tobago's territorial waters, because there's a difference. That those, as I said, those were the major sticking points. And I'll tell you why. It's because finance and territoriality are inextricably linked. And there is a misconception that Tobago makes little or no contribution to the national coffers. So it's as though every Tobago House of Assembly budget that is read, the perception by quite a number of persons in this unitary state is that Tobago comes begging cap in hand and Trinidad had to mind Tobago, and them Tobagonians always making noise and all of that. But the but you have to bear in mind, as I said, this idea of finance and territoriality, and in terms of defining maritime space, because for a Tobagonian who has, for example, grown up in Mount St. George, accustomed to seeing flares offshore, because there is activity taking place with regard to extraction of resources. For the fisher folk on the north side of the island who would have had their livelihood disrupted when seismic activity is going on because of natural gas exploration and so on, to them, it is disrespectful and disingenuous to assert that Tobago contributes nothing to the treasury, so that the territorial issue goes directly to the finance issue, because one of the considerations is not, we don't just stick to what the dispute resolution committee gave as the formula or the new high mark in the new permutation of the act, but that in addition to that, there be, whether it's 8% or 10% of the revenues derived from the extraction of Tobago's resources. And of course, if that is the kind of consideration, it removes the psychological and sociological barriers that suggest that Tobago is always begging for money. And again, if we go back to where I started off about where power resides, it also seems like that, because the issue of finance or financing the assembly goes to cabinet. And it is the Minister of Finance who, in his budget presentation, speaks on the allocation, the financial allocation to the Tobago House of Assembly. And just to show you how that finance issue is always one that sometimes it may not be as evident in the public domain, depending on who is in power in Trinidad and who is in power in Tobago. If you have the same parties in power in both places, then you may hear comments like, well, we didn't get what we want, but we'll make it work. But anytime the parties differ, it descends into confusion and political wrangling. That's and correct. So on. But at the end of the day, we go right back to Section 75.1. That is the power and the remit of the cabinet. Yes, so I don't know if I've made that clear. As I keep bringing it back to Section 75.1 to try to cause you to realize that notwithstanding any provisions in any permutation of the legislation, if that particular aspect of it, which is that it continues to be an assignation of responsibility rather than power sharing, we're always going to descend in fracas, as we often do every few years.
Thank you so much for that. I really appreciated that. Where you believe the bill misses some very important elements that that can be very contentious, right? Both in just social discussions or on a political, in terms of governance issue. I understand what you're saying, but I mean, since I've known myself, Trinidad and Tobago is a very, very funny place, right?
Very.
And given the political landscape in particular, do you think that the bill is likely to become law?
Well, we saw that already because we saw that what obtains now, the opposition failed to give support to it.
Correct.
And that is just exactly it. And again, using a little plug here, showing again where power resides. So here it is that a parliament in Trinidad where out of 41 members in the House of Representatives, you have only 2 representatives from Tobago. So even if, for example, the THA would have drafted a bill, which has happened before, sent a bill down, it doesn't even have to be within the context of this current political climate. Any political climate would be one where any bill which treats with Tobago or emanates from Tobago or treats with autonomy and so on is not one that may pass because you require supports from places that have nothing to do with responsibility for Tobago. I don't know if you understand clearly what I'm getting
I do.
at. Structure of the House of Representatives and then the Senate. And even in the Senate, okay, so you say, I just said two members from Tobago East, Tobago West. That's House of Representatives. But there is nothing in the Constitution that requires that any member of the Senate be from Tobago or represent Tobago's interests. You have government senators, you have opposition senators, and those are appointed at the president's discretion. Nowhere there does it say anything about Tobago or Tobago being represented. Now, the practice may have been that you may have an independent senator or something from Tobago, but in the context of where you need certain kinds of numbers, and if you're talking about constitutional changes, you need even greater numbers. Correct. You see how high of a hurdle that is to overcome.
All right. Thank you very much for that. And I mean, I'm glad that you added that part in terms of the Senate, because under law and based on how the parliament is structured, it really only allows for 3 groups of representation, which is government, who's in power, opposition, and president. And as you rightfully said, many times, whether the president would do it or the prime minister or the opposition, sometimes they would put persons from Tobago to at least try to show that there is some representation. But it isn't really formed in a way whereby Tobago must have a part within the structure of the upper house. So I understand what you're saying there, and that is very interesting. But in terms of the average Tobagonian, because I mean we introduced you today as a daughter of Tobago. You have to live Tobago all your life, right? I've visited Tobago many times. I've gotten some opinions on this question I'm about to ask you. But you being in Tobago more often than I am, and Mr. Dinoon as well, I would say, what do you think the average Tobagonian want in terms of autonomy?
Well, I will not pretend to be the voice of all Tobagonians because Tobagonians we are not a monolith. But I'll give you an example. And you can draw from that whatever you want to draw from it.
No problem.
So I remember when there were consultations public consultations. I think it was for the Ghani draft, which eventually led to the Ghani draft. I think this may have been like 2012 or something like that. And at one of those consultations, I remember it was at the Signal Hill Comprehensive School in Tobago, and a gentleman got up in the auditorium, and his comment was that autonomy for him is a situation where his application for a license does not have to be determined by a decision maker in Trinidad.
Wow.
That's as simple as I would put it, because I felt, yes, I don't think there's anything for me to add to that. Yeah. So it's a very practical consideration for a Tobagonian.
Thank you so much for all of your comments thus far. You have really helped to open my eyes as it relates to the situation in Tobago, because I would normally go to Tobago, and you also highlighted, just as Leonardo said, that whole aspect of the Senate, where there's no real requirement that Tobago should be represented. All right. And I would like to also say that is something that needs to be urgently considered. The parliamentary structure should give more representation to Tobago. Just have one final question as it relates to what you believe would be the benefits of increased autonomy for the people of Tobago.
The best way I think I can put that is a system that is representative of a union of equals. A union of equals.
Well said.
Well, we will take that. We will take that. That is a good answer.
I think I shocked Mr. Diduna a little bit. He took a little while, like he had to let it marinate a little bit.
Of course, yes. No, but that is a good answer. Short and sweet and to the point.
Yeah.
So, final words to you, Mrs. Wallace. What are your final words today?
Right. So, as I said, although I'm an attorney at law, I would have started out my academic journey in social sciences. So it has influenced a great deal how I look at this entire idea of self-determination, devolution of power, autonomy, where sovereignty and all those things. Of course, this is backed up by having qualifications in law. And very often, law does not treat with some of the social aspects of it. So perhaps that is why I think my perspective on this issue is the sort of perspective that I've given. I hope I was very clear. But to that, I would say that we have to consider that Trinidad and Tobago are islands separated by water. They are islands, though there is a lot that is similar. There are many things that are different. Islands which may have disparate cultures and values and ideals and so on. And there must be, within the context of this arrangement that is Trinidad and Tobago, consideration, I believe, for the historical antecedent. And I don't think this is an issue solely about Tobago and Tobago's autonomy. But theorists would have told you that a constitution is supposed to be indicative of the aspirations. It is. I think Francis Alexis said it is the birth. It is to be regarded as the birth paper of the state. And if you think about that kind of thing, then you realize that perhaps what we have now is not really indicative of who we may want to be. And as I said, this is not only a Tobago thing, because there are aspects of the state and aspects of Trinidad that need to be addressed from a constitutional perspective. So I think I am happy when we have these little eruptions. I'm happy when we have these types of conversations, because it means we're growing as a state, and hopefully we're thinking so that one day we may eventually arrive to a state or a position where we realize that we need to redefine how we are defined in the constitution that we have now, in order to meet all the dynamics of this space called Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you so much for that, Mr. Joseph-Wallace. Mr. Torres, final words to you, sir.
All right. I really want to thank you, Mrs. Joseph-Wallace, for such an illuminating conversation. You have brought so much different perspectives, different pieces of information, and things that I think most persons are not aware of or are not paying attention to, in terms of where that separation or the lack of representation occurs. And I really, really want to thank you for your time today. I know from the moment you were introduced and I got an idea of who you are, I knew that we would have had an excellent conversation today, and I'm in no way disappointed again. I really want to thank you, and I'm hoping, for the sake of Trinidad and Tobago, and more so Tobagonians, that there is proper representation moving forward. There is a fair share of power for the sake of interests that may not really be for Trinidad, but really are affecting the people of Tobago, because they deserve that. And I really, really, I want to thank you again for your time today. It was wonderful.
Thank you for having me. I appreciated the invitation, and I hope I did justice to the call, to the invite. I really hope that occurred. And if there is one thing I hope this conversation would lead to, is that if persons are to just sit and think just for a moment, if the shoe were on the other foot, if I existed and operated in a system that was structured in such a way that I was guaranteed to have a very limited voice, would I be comfortable?
That's
Yes?
correct.
Yeah.
It was a
Indeed,
pleasure.
tremendous food for thought. So thank you again, Mr. Joseph-Wallace. It has been our pleasure. This has brought us to the end of another episode of the Legal Corner podcast series. We thank you so much for tuning in. Remember to catch us on social media, and we look forward to hearing from you. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening to the Legal Corner podcast series. For more information, please visit us at our Facebook or Instagram pages, or send your comments to thelegalcornerpodcast@gmail.com. We look forward to hearing from you.